So I'd like to talk about Pathfinder, the arcane man, Pathfinder. So numbers and symbols only represent what they do to us based on the weaning from the internal trust, the navigation system that one ultimately survived because of a cunning grit, an intuitive awareness, a connection to a greater whole, a conscious awareness that never ceases, even as one sleeps. So the Pathfinder would see the symbol, in reference to gematria, symbols, a doxastic view when looking at the multifarious layers, or at least 4 layers, involving symbology and mathematics and logic. So you look at something like this, right? You see this, make sure there's no pertinent information on there, not really. So you see that number? Yeah, it's probably backwards, I don't know, 1, 2, 6, 4. So you see that 1, envision that 1 in your mind, okay? That would be a direction, right? That's a mapping system on a localized scale. But the more intellectual, the wise leader a Pathfinder may have become through trial and error, but also mystical experience. I kind of think about that animated series Primal right now. It's interesting. Yellow Jackets, Dune, every story leads back to this witchcraft, right? I'm not going to use any filler words like prosaic or non-prosaic, because the poetry that's involved is about storytelling, right? And it's through oral traditions that a lot of this information is passed down. So you see the straight line, you see the 1, you see a direction, a sagittal direction between forward and back. 2 would represent going around a body. If you were to start at the top, loop around, and end your way down at the bottom there, right? You would be finding the way to the path, but you may be realistically navigating from a topographical sense, looking at a mapping system. You may be having to go around this curve, a linear, right, direction to meet back at the path, based on a river system, right? 6 implies something very different here, okay? We're just going off the numbers as representation. 6, right? 6, you'd be starting up here. Why would one go through a movement like that, right? Unless they were trying to ward off animals, other humans, trackers, or if they were actually climbing around a hill or a mound or down into a cavern, that would imply this rotary motion, right? That, in other words, there's only so many scenarios as to why, from a topographical sense, a certain shape would be made, and the shape doesn't identify the elevation. 4 is more of a marker, right? It's more of a marker. But if you were to do a movement like a 4, where you're walking in one specific direction, and then you come down in a diagonal sense, and then basically jettison back and cross paths with your original path, right? Again, you would either be warding off a tracker, a more dangerous, larger animal, or a group of animals, or a specific competing race of peoples. But also, it would imply, on the same measure, crossing a bridge, going under a bridge, and passing through a road system that is on another dimensional scale. We see the numbers 3, 6, 9, and evidently the 9 becomes really the reversal of the 6, right? Where we might be walking back out of a sort of phi or phi swirl elevation change, right? Or going around to evade the obvious trails of where you were, or where you once were. The 3 that I always talk about being the representation of really a broken sphere, or an open sphere, or an open egg, really implies the tracking and the searching for, or the stowing away of resources for later use, right? That it really does show a directive mapping system that has become a part of our culture to the point where it's been inducted and shown to the youngest of us, and really passed down again through, like the Gaelic songs passed down through oral tradition, hearkening and hailing back to a rune stone, right? Or rune symbolism. Again, taking this doxastic sort of point of view. And then we get into the number 5, right? If we wanted to use the V as a specific representation, we could. But what we find in the interpretation of our number system that we use broadly, globally around the world today, it shows a complexity of symbolism and patterns, right? And so you have to ask yourself, what if I started from this direction, went down an obvious path, went down another seemingly unnatural path where you have this linear or this straight line, and then you go around, right? So what does that circle represent? Does that circle represent the way home? Does it represent a spherical body or a way in? Does it represent, again, a change in, or a walking around, a pacing around, a pathway around and through a hard to navigate elevated environment? Or is it to throw off the scent, the tracking of another species that wishes to take us out, another animal that is a predator to the human civilization, right? And then you get into numbers like 7, right? Where the path becomes clear. There is not a specific linear throughway like the 1, but there is a deviation, almost like if one were to bunk in a particular area for the night, right? Or to take temporary leave while nomadically traveling on a trail. You see the 7 as a representation of deviating off a path quite intentionally, only to meet the path again nearby and to be able to then carry on, right? So they're almost like a quarterback's playbook to directionality, right? And then we get into the 8. That's oftentimes seen as this number for infinity, this ever looping S-type energy field that is on a closed loop, right? It can even be depicted as the Ouroboros or the snake eating its tail on some levels, but we also see this sort of infinite directionality implied here, right? But again, if we were to start at one specific point of origin, and we were to say that if we consider ourselves those of the north, like the Hyperboreans, right? Those of the north, and we're starting from one specific location only to loop back around, right? We do see a somewhat linear directionality, a long course travel, right? The 8 would be a way through a long journey as to throw off and to not leave any specific linear implications that you are going in a specific direction, right? So the Pathfinder sees the number system in a specific way, goes through and repeats this number system, charts this number system with the 0, right? Which is the implication of the return home, right? And when you have this 1, this linear direction, and the 0 or the O, or really the monad or the sphere, you see that it's telling you the entire story in very simple terms without any deviations whatsoever. We have pi, right, to represent this. So you start in one specific point of origin and you loop back around, right, through a measured, pre-planned route right back to where you began. So the Pathfinder and the number, when you begin to see the information that is embedded in the cipher code of the number systems that we use, and from an arcane or an archaic sense, how gematria really comes together when there is no distinguishing between the letter and the number.